The price of gold. Escaping a toxic family legacy. I was 26 when my family finally imploded. The cracks had been there forever, hairline fractures widening into chasms with each passing year. That night, at my mother's birthday dinner, the fault lines became inescapable. We were gathered around the familiar mahogany table, the same one that had witnessed countless Sunday dinners and holiday feasts. My father, a man sculpted from granite and disapproval, sat at the head. Beside him, shimmering in his golden light, with my sister Tiffany. And then there was me, David, the perennial family disappointment, forever measured against Tiffany's unattainable perfection, despite my stable job and independent life. The evening lumbered forward, a predictable replay of every family gathering. Then, Tiffany dropped her bombshell. "I'm thinking about getting a new car," she announced, twirling her pasta. "Something sporty. Maybe a convertible." My father's face lit up. "You deserve it, sweetheart. You work so hard." I choked down my irritation with a large gulp of Cabernet. Tiffany, 23, worked part-time at a trendy boutique, lived in a chic apartment downtown, an apartment I was already subsidizing, a fact my parents conveniently overlooked. My father swiveled his gaze to me, his expression hardening. "David, what do you think? You could help your sister out with this, right?" My hand froze, wine glass suspended in midair. The sheer audacity of it. I carefully lowered the glass. "I already pay half her rent," I stated, my voice dangerously level. "That should be enough." The temperature in the room plummeted. "What's that supposed to mean?" My father snarled, that familiar, menacing edge creeping into his voice. "It means exactly what I said. I already support Tiffany financially. I'm not buying her car on top of it." Tiffany's face contorted into a practiced pout. "I thought you were doing so well at work. It's just a little help." "A little help?" I echoed, my jaw clenching. Like the little help I'd been providing for years. The little help that had kept me from moving into a nicer apartment or taking that long-dreamed-of trip to Italy. "I'm doing well. That doesn't mean I'm obligated to finance your lifestyle." My father's face darkened, thunder gathering in his brow. "Is this how you treat your sister? After everything we've done for you?" The guilt trip. The vague, ominous references to sacrifices. The implied debt for the simple act of being raised. Something inside me finally snapped. "What exactly have you done for me, Dad? Tell me." "Because I paid for my own college, bought my own car, and I've been financially independent since I was 19. His eyes bulged. "You ungrateful." "No, Ira Turca." My voice gaining strength. "I'm not ungrateful. I am tired. Tired of being treated like the family ATM while you treat Tiffany like she's too fragile to support herself." "Because she is better than you," he roared, slamming his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "She always has been." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My mother gasped. Tiffany averted her eyes. But I felt a strange, liberating relief. Finally, the unspoken truth dragged into the light. I laughed, a raw, almost hysterical sound. "Well, if she's so much better than me, I guess she doesn't need my help anymore, does she?" I stood, the scraping of my chair a violent punctuation mark. "That means I won't be paying her rent next month or ever again." My father surged to his feet, pointing a trembling finger towards a door. "Get out of my house." "Gladly," I said, grabbing my jacket. "Oh, and Dad, you might want to check who's actually been covering Tiffany's rent for the past 2 years before you kick out your personal bank." Tiffany's eyes widened, panic flickering in their depths. "What's that supposed to mean?" I paused in the doorway, savoring the moment. "It means I'm done. You've been living in that apartment for 2 years. I've paid half your rent for 2 years. Dad hasn't contributed a dime, despite what he told you." Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. "But," Dad said, "Dade leet." I said simply, "And now you're on your own." That night marked the beginning of the end, or perhaps the beginning of my freedom. Perspective is a funny thing. The fallout was swift and devastating. Tiffany, predictably, couldn't afford her rent. She bombarded me with calls, 17 in the first week, her messages morphing from angry demands to tearful pleas. My father, despite his bluster about family obligation, refused to step in. It turned out his own financial situation wasn't as rock solid as he'd led everyone to believe. I emptied the joint emergency account I'd foolishly maintained with Tiffany. Emergencies that invariably involved designer shoes and weekend getaways. She treated it like her personal slush fund, while I religiously deposited money every month. My father was livid. He threatened to sell my car, the one I'd bought at 19, paid off at 23. When I reminded him that the title was in my name, he went ballistic, accusing me of being untrustworthy and tearing the family apart. I later discovered he'd actually tried to sell it, listing it online, everything. When I went to their house to retrieve my car, the confrontation escalated. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as my father raged about family loyalty, while I calmly loaded my belongings into the trunk. My mother stood on the porch, wringing her hands, begging us to stop making a scene, always more concerned with appearances than with the truth. What I didn't know then was that my father had a far more elaborate trap waiting. 3 days later, an official-looking letter landed on my doorstep. My stomach dropped as I scanned it, a notice of repossession for my car. It made no sense. I paid it off years ago. The title was in my name. I called the bank listed on the notice. After navigating a labyrinth of transfers, I finally spoke to someone who explained the situation. According to their records, my father had taken out a title loan against my car 6 months earlier. My blood ran cold. That's impossible. I have the title. He couldn't have done that. Sir, we have all the paperwork here, the representative said, his voice devoid of emotion. Signed by you. But I hadn't signed anything. I demanded copies of the documents. When they arrived an hour later, I stared at them in disbelief. There it was, my signature, or what looked like my signature, perfectly forged on loan documents I'd never seen. My father had used my social security number, likely copied the signature from old-school records. I felt violated, exposed. This wasn't just financial manipulation. This was identity theft. This was criminal. The next few days were a blur of betrayal and rage. My father had been planning this for months, plotting to use my property as collateral for his own failing ventures, all while demanding I support his precious Tiffany. The bank was sympathetic but firm. Either I paid the $7,000 loan my father had fraudulently taken out, or they would repossess the car. I saw only one way out. I sold the car myself, paid off the fraudulent loan, and used the remaining money to buy a much cheaper, less desirable vehicle. It was a significant downgrade, but it severed one more tie to my father's control. When he discovered what I'd done, he called in a screaming rage. How dare I sell his car? Didn't I know he needed that money? Didn't I understand what this would do to the family? I hung up. His problems were no longer mine. But the worst betrayal was yet to come. 3 weeks after that disastrous dinner, I discovered my father had been systematically draining our family savings account, an account I'd been contributing to since my first job at 16. He'd been taking out loans against it, using the money to cover Tiffany's shopping sprees and his own failing business ventures. My name was still on that account. The next morning, I walked into the bank and withdrew every last cent, all $7,853 of it. Not a fortune, but rightfully mine. Then, I closed the account. My phone rang that afternoon. My father's name flashed on the screen. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was a toxic cocktail of rage and panic. Taking what's mine before you steal the rest, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I needed that money, he shrieked. The collectors are coming next week. My heart raced, but not from fear, from a sickening clarity. This had never been about family. It had always been about using me. Not my problem anymore. You can't do this to us. We're family. Family doesn't steal from each other, Dad. I hung up, blocked his number, blocked Tiffany's too. I changed the locks on my apartment door. It wasn't enough. 2 days later, I came home to find my apartment door ajar. My television was gone. My laptop. The watch my grandfather had left me. My father had stolen my spare key from my mother's emergency contact list. I called the police, filed a report. They tracked my electronics to a pawn shop across town. The owner remembered my father clearly, had his signature on the receipt. I contacted a lawyer, recorded my father on the phone, admitting to the theft. I threatened to press charges unless he returned every dollar he'd ever taken from me. He paid every cent, and I cut all ties. This decision wasn't made impulsively. It came after countless sleepless nights, my hands trembling as I packed my apartment, questioning everything I thought I knew about family and obligation. I've been raised to believe that family bonds were unbreakable, sacred, that you forgave family, no matter what, because blood was thicker than water. My father had drilled these mantras into me my entire life, even as he systematically exploited and undermined me. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating. How could I abandon the people who had raised me? What kind of person walks away from their family completely? But then, what kind of father steals from his son? What kind of father forges signatures and drains bank accounts? What kind of father breaks into his child's home? The guilt of leaving wrestled with the terror of staying. I wrote pages of pros and cons, called an old therapist, talked it through with the two friends who knew the full extent of the situation. The turning point came one night at 3 a.m. I was lying awake, my stomach a knot of anxiety, when a simple question crystallized in my mind. Would I allow anyone else to treat me this way? The answer was immediate, visceral. No, never. So why was I allowing it from the people who were supposed to love me more than anyone else? That clarity didn't make the decision easier. It just made it necessary. I moved to a new apartment, changed jobs, and went completely off the grid as far as my family was concerned. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to remove yourself from the source of the pain. The first few months of no contact were brutal. Holidays were empty, birthdays passed unmarked. I'd reach for my phone to text Tiffany about a movie she'd love, or call my mom when I cooked one of her recipes. Then I'd remember they weren't part of my life anymore. I'd question my decision, wondering if I was overreacting, if I should just apologize and try to mend things. Then I'd remember the theft, the lies, the years of manipulation, and I'd put the phone down. Doubt would creep in at night, when the apartment felt too quiet and my thoughts too loud. Was I being cruel? Selfish? What if they needed me? What if they were sorry? But deep down, I knew the pattern would only repeat. My father would manipulate, Tiffany would take, my mother would enable, and I would be left drained and depleted, wondering why I was never enough. So I held firm. I built new traditions, found new friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. Slowly, the raw wound of separation began to heal. 6 months later, an email from Tiffany landed in my inbox. She was pregnant. The father had left. She needed help. We're family, she wrote. Family sticks together. I stared at those words for a long time, my finger hovering over the reply button. Part of me, the part conditioned by years of guilt and obligation, wanted to rush in and rescue her, to prove I was a good brother, a good person. But another part, the part one was learning to listen to, recognize the familiar pattern, the crisis, the appeal to family loyalty, the expectation that I would set aside my boundaries because she needed me. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat with the email open, examining my feelings. There was sadness for her situation, concern for the unborn child, a reflexive urge to fix things. But there was also a profound weariness, a recognition that this cycle would never end unless I ended it. I closed the email without responding. Later that night, after more reflection, I marked it as spam and moved on with my life. That was 3 years ago. My new apartment has a breathtaking view of the city. I've been promoted twice at work. I travel whenever I want. No one drains my bank accounts or makes me feel guilty for having boundaries. Sometimes, healing looks like walking away. Sometimes it's not about fixing what's broken, but about accepting that some things weren't built properly in the first place. Last week, I saw my mother at the grocery store. We made eye contact across the produce section. She looked older, tired. I felt a momentary pang of something, not quite guilt, not quite sadness, more like echoes of what might have been a different family. She approached cautiously, like I might bolt. Maybe I would have once. You look well, she said, her eyes taking in my appearance. I nodded. I am well. She fidgeted with her purse strap. Your father had a heart attack last month. My pulse quickened. Old conditioning dies hard. Is he okay? He'll recover, but it was serious. I waited for the guilt trip, the manipulation, the expectation that I would come running back. Checkbook in hand. It didn't come. Instead, she said, I've been doing some thinking about everything. I should have stepped in. I should have protected you. My throat tightened unexpectedly. This wasn't in the script. Yes, I agreed. You should have. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me, or him. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you left. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. 3 years of distance, and her simple acknowledgement still had the power to move me. Tiffany named her baby after you, she said softly. Even after everything. I stared at the apples in my hand, suddenly very interested in their shiny red skin. She's still living with you? Yes. She's trying, though. Working full-time now. Taking classes at night. I felt nothing but a distant pity. Good for her. My mother looked like she wanted to say more, but stopped herself. Instead, she reached out, hesitated, then gently touched my arm. I'm proud of you, she whispered. I should have said that more. The words settled around me like fallen leaves, too late to change seasons, but still somehow significant. Thank you, I said, and meant it. We didn't exchange numbers, didn't make plans to reconnect. Some bridges, once burned, leave only ashes. But as I watched her walk away, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. But understanding, perhaps. Recognition that we were all broken in our own ways, playing out patterns established long before we had any say in the matter. The truth is, going no contact wasn't a single decision made in a moment of anger. It was thousands of tiny choices made every day for years. The choice not to call when I was lonely, not to reach out during holidays, not to respond to the occasional messages that found their way to me through mutual acquaintances. Each choice was accompanied by its own grief, its own questioning, its own internal battle between what I'd been taught to value and what I needed to survive. I'd wonder during these moments if cutting them off completely had been too extreme, if there might have been some middle ground, careful distance rather than complete separation. But then I'd remember the violation of having my identity stolen, the betrayal of finding my apartment ransacked, the years of being valued only for what I could provide, never for who I was. And I'd know, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that no contact had been my only viable path to healing. My father had always called Tiffany the golden child, but gold is soft, malleable. It bends under pressure. What he never understood was that pressure had turned me into something stronger, like carbon in a diamond, forged in the fire of his disappointment. The most important family is the one you choose, the one you build, the one that sees your worth without demanding you prove it constantly. I found mine in unexpected places, in friends who show up without being asked, in colleagues who value my contributions, in my own company, which turns out to be far better than I'd ever given it credit for. Some people say blood is thicker than water, but I've learned that self-respect is thicker than both. To anyone trapped in a family dynamic that drains rather than sustains you, there is life on the other side. It may not come with a neat resolution we're taught to expect. It may not include tearful reunions or dramatic forgiveness scenes, but it comes with peace, with quiet mornings where you don't wake up dreading phone calls, with holidays spent exactly as you choose, with a profound realization that your value was never determined by those who couldn't see it. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to walk away and let the pieces fall where they may. There are days I still dream of reconciliation, of a family healed and whole. But dreams aren't the same as delusions. I know now that some wounds never fully close, and that's okay. Breaking free isn't just about distance. It's about deprogramming, unlearning the idea that saying no makes you selfish, that having boundaries makes you cruel, that choosing yourself makes you a bad person. It's the hardest work I've ever done, and it's ongoing. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living on my own terms, not as the family disappointment, not as Tiffany's supporting character, not as my father's ATM or my mother's peacemaker. Just as myself, whole and complete, without needing anyone else's validation or approval. There's a strange grief in that, too. Mourning the family I never had and never will have. The unconditional love I sought, but never found in the places it should have been most abundant. But there's also profound freedom in choosing my path, in defining my worth. In recognizing that while I didn't choose the family I was born into, I can choose how their influence shapes my future. And I choose to break the cycle, to heal, to thrive, not despite them, but because I finally realized I deserved more than what they were willing to give.